matter how absurd the narrative becomes.
A fourth dose boost.
Must stay home. Public schools will be closed.
People will continue to buy into it. At least the 20 or 30% of the population that is really in the grip and that is really hypnotized. Because that's what it truly is. It's a process of hypnosis for certain people.
Why did large swaths of society suddenly buy into masking toddlers or restricting people from visiting their loved ones, even as they lay on their deathbeds? Today I sit down with Mattias Desmet, a professor of clinical psychology and author of The Psychology of Totalitarianism. Desmet is one of the world's leading experts on the phenomenon known as mass formation, which can occur when people are isolated from one another and free-floating anxiety is prevalent.
The real reason why they buy into the narrative is always because it leads to this new social bond, because it frees them from their anxiety, because it enables them to direct their frustration and aggression at something.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Janja Kellick. Professor Mattias Desmet, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, quite a number of people have actually been talking to me about your work. And when I learned that you were writing a book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, I was frankly very excited to read it. You're writing about it in a context of what's happening around coronavirus policy or coronavirus mania almost, as you describe it in some ways. But you were actually thinking about these sorts of things well before COVID was around.
Yes, that's right. Yes, I started to think about it in 2017 actually, and maybe even before that. But in 2017, I started to take notes to gather all kinds of ideas and thoughts about totalitarianism, just because I noticed in 2017 that like a new kind of totalitarianism was slowly emerging in our society, not a fascist or a communist totalitarianism, but what we might call a technocratic totalitarianism, meaning that we were heading for a society in which relied more and more on technological control to tackle the emerging objects of anxiety in our society, meaning there's such things as terrorism, climate change, and so on. It seems that a major part of the population and a major part of the leaders of society were inclined to accept that only technological control, which also controlled private space and private life, would be sufficient to, or would be necessary to deal with all the emerging problems in our society, real or imagined problems.
So that's fascinating. And why don't we actually start here? Why don't you tell me a little bit about your field of study and how you come to be thinking casually about such things?
Yes, well, I'm a clinical psychologist. I have a master's degree in clinical psychology. And I also later on in my career, I also got a master in statistics, just because I became interested in the problems with academic research in general. In 2005, it became clear that most academic research is flawed. For instance, John Ioannidis, a professor in medical statistics at Stanford, wrote this wonderful paper somewhere back in 2007, which was titled Why Most Published Research Findings Are False. And I was immediately fascinated by the problem of flawed research. I started to study it. I tried to explain to people what the problems were at the level of research that it usually leads to the wrong conclusions. And from there on, I also started to become interested in all kinds of flawed information that circulates in society, which contains intentional or unintentional, all kinds of misleading information, which nevertheless has a huge grip on society and has a huge impact on society. Together with that, I was also fascinated by the fact that most people, in a very strange way, most people actually continue to believe in narratives and in information that is utterly absurd in many respects. And in a strange way, most people, or many people, are incapable, radically incapable of taking a critical distance of what society believes in and see that this narratives or this information they believe in fail to see that it cannot be true. And that stimulated my interest in the phenomenon of mass formation, a phenomenon that I'm studying now for about 10 years, and which is, I think, the only explanation why people can continue to believe in narratives that are often blatantly wrong, that always are highly damaging for their individual interests, which often leads them to fanatically believe, so fanatically in a narrative that they become radically intolerant for dissonant voices, and that in the end, they also stigmatize and ultimately try to destroy the people who do not go along with the narrative. And they typically do so as if it is their ethical duty to do so. That's the phenomenon of mass formation. Mass formation is a specific kind of group formation which has a very specific impact at the level of individual psychological functioning, which makes the individuals that are in the grip of it radically blind for the absurd characteristics of what the group believe in, which makes them willing to sacrifice everything that used to be important for them, and which also makes them radically intolerant for all dissonant voices and makes them stigmatize, eventually commit cruelties towards the people that do not buy into the narrative. So throughout my career, I became more and more fascinated with this phenomenon because I noticed on the one hand how absurd narratives were circulating in society, had a huge impact on society, and because I noticed that many people, in a strange way, were incapable of noticing that something absurd was going on. And I started to think of that much earlier, and I also was aware of the fact that it is exactly this kind of mass formation that leads to the emergence of totalitarian states. And when the corona crisis started, I just knew that exactly this was going on in our society. I observed how absurd statistics were circulating in public space. I saw how everybody seems to be in the grip of a kind of statistical information that was, according to me, radically wrong. And I noticed how, again, society seemed to be completely blind for all counter-arguments and for all the observations that could have made clear that the narrative they believed in was wrong. And I noticed also how, indeed, a major part of the population tended to stigmatize everyone who didn't buy into the narrative and seemed to be willing to exclude a large part of society, of the population from public space if they were not willing to conform to the dominant ideology. So, in a strange way, I noticed that everything that I had been studying in the last years seemed to be happening now in public space, and I decided to start to speak out, to publish some opinion papers about this, and eventually to write my book, The Psychology of Totalitarianism, which tries to explain how this phenomenon of mass formation works, why it becomes stronger and stronger throughout the last few hundred years, and then in specific, what we can do about it to make sure that it doesn't lead to the destruction of a major part of the population, and eventually not only to the destruction of the people who do not go along with the masses, but also to the destruction of the masses itself, because that is so typical of mass formation in the end.